The storm had been raging for hours, but no one came. No midwife, no doctor, just the howling wind and the burning pain tearing through her body. Annie clutched the wool blanket tighter around her swollen belly as thunder cracked overhead, rattling the fragile wooden poles of the teepee. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the furs she lay on. Her screams were swallowed by the storm. Outside, the world was all shadows and fury. Inside, she was alone, barely 17 and about to bring a child into a world that had abandoned her. Then, through the haze of pain, a hand touched her shoulder. Weathered, strong. A woman's voice whispered something soft in Lakota. A stranger. A savior. The old native woman knelt beside her and began to guide her through the most terrifying moment of her life. Annie's cry of agony broke into a sob, of relief as her baby let out its first breathless wail. She had nothing but this child. No home, no husband, no past she dared to return to. But in that moment, bathed in firelight, wrapped in the arms of strangers, she realized something shocking. She had been lost, but maybe now she'd been found. Before we jump back in, introduce yourself and where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special just for you. The town of Dry Creek was barely more than a breath of dust clinging to the edge of the prairie. It didn't rise up from the land so much as settle into it, like it had grown tired halfway through being built. A row of weather-stained buildings lined the single dirt road: saloon, mercantile, blacksmith, sheriff's office, all coated in a film of red grit that never truly lifted, no matter the season. The wind moved through like an old ghost, whistling, down the alleyways and rattling loose shutters like bones in a wooden cage. Folks here didn't talk much, not to strangers, and definitely not to her. Annie Mae Callahan walked with a limp that never healed right after the fall off her father's wagon 3 years back. It was a strange twist in her left leg, subtle but noticeable. Like one of her hips no longer trusted the other. She didn't complain. She never had. But the townspeople whispered. And they looked. That was worse than the limp. Worse than the ache in her joints when it rained. They looked at her like she was cursed. Like she carried something catching, bad luck or shame. She kept her head down and her voice soft. Didn't do much good. Rumors stuck to her like mud. They said she was trouble. That her ma died birthing her and her pa drowned in whiskey trying to forget. That she'd cursed the Callahan name. That her limp was a sign. Some said she was touched by the devil. Others said she was just plain broken. The only one who'd ever spoken kindly of her was old Miss Addie, the dressmaker. But she'd passed last winter, and since then, Annie hadn't had a soul to lean on. She was 17, but her eyes looked 30, gray with weariness, and the quiet loneliness of someone who'd learned too early that the world didn't owe her kindness. She lived on the edge of town in the abandoned smokehouse her father once built. It was barely big enough for a bed and a wood stove, but she kept it clean. Every morning she'd walk to the river to wash, and every evening she'd trade eggs or hand-sewn cloth scraps at the general store for flour or salt. The owner's wife, Mrs. Hartley, never spoke to her directly, just nodded, took her trade, and moved on. Annie didn't cry about it. She had cried once, but that was when she still believed it mattered if people liked her. Now the silence was louder than any insult. She'd come to know it like an old companion, the kind that never leaves even when you beg it to. Once, a traveling preacher had come through Dry Creek and tried to speak to her. He'd said her soul looked heavy, that maybe she needed to unburden it. She'd just smiled politely and walked away. What could she say? That her soul was heavy because she'd tasted love once, and it had left her with more than just memories. Nobody in Dry Creek knew about him. Not really. There were whispers, sure, of a young man from the city with soft hands and dangerous eyes. But they didn't know what it had meant to Annie. They didn't see how her face lit up in those secret stolen moments behind the old chapel, when he'd called her beautiful. They didn't hear how he'd promised he'd come back, that he'd send for her, that she'd never be alone again. He never came back. And a few weeks after he was gone, Annie found herself holding the secret he left behind, growing quietly beneath her ribcage. At first she thought it might be sickness, a fever. Then came the morning sickness, the missed bleeding, the way her hands trembled when she realized what was happening. She hadn't even kissed another soul before him. And now, she carried his child. In Dry Creek, there was no room for girls with limp legs and round bellies out of wedlock. She knew that. She didn't tell anyone. She just started sewing more, patching worn blankets, bartering with ranchers, doing anything she could to prepare for a life that was arriving faster than she was ready for. By her 7th month, the bump was impossible to hide. That's when the whispers turned crueler. Children pointed in the streets. Women crossed to the other side when she passed. Men lowered their hats and muttered words she couldn't hear, but felt. Deep in her bones, the sheriff came once, told her it might be best if she left town before folks got too riled up. He didn't say it unkindly, just matter of fact, like he was telling her the weather report. She nodded, said she understood, packed what little she had that night. 2 dresses, a quilt, a jar of dried apples, and a heart that still held on to the tiniest, most foolish spark of hope. That's how she found herself wandering the outskirts of Lakota territory, tired, swollen, and with nowhere left to go. She didn't expect mercy. She didn't even expect to survive the week, but something was calling her into the hills. Not a voice, not a vision, just something. The kind of something a girl with nothing left to lose will follow without asking why. And she did. She followed it into the arms of a people who should have turned her away, but didn't. Before we dive deeper into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. The Lakota village rested like a secret at the edge of the pine forest, cradled in the valley between 2 hills. Smoke curled upward from low fires. Children ran barefoot through the tall grass. Horses grazed along the ridge. It was a place of rhythm and quiet, where the world moved slower and life had space to breathe. Annie didn't belong here. She knew that from the moment they let her stay. They gave her shelter in a teepee that stood just outside the main circle, near the river bend. The women, especially the older ones, watched her with steady, unreadable eyes. Some offered herbs, some silence, but not once did they ask her to leave. Perhaps they saw her pain in the way she winced as she moved, or maybe they simply believed that no one should give birth alone. It was on her 3rd evening there, as the sun spilled red gold across the valley, that she saw him. He stood at the edge of the woods, splitting firewood with quiet efficiency. His shirt clung to his back, soaked in sweat. A single braid hung over his shoulder. His skin was the same bronze as the hills in late summer, and his eyes, dark, still, and steady as water held in a stone basin. He didn't glance her way. Not then. But something shifted inside her. A flicker, a question, the kind that stirs before you're ready to feel anything again. His name was Wikasa. She learned it from an old woman who brought her cornmeal and tea. Wikasa, she said with a half-smile. Strong heart, quiet man. That night, Annie sat near the central fire, her hands cradling her belly as the Lakota spoke softly among themselves. She didn't understand their words, but she understood the music in them, the patience, the calm. Wikasa sat nearby, sharpening a bone knife. He didn't look at her. But he didn't avoid her either. A few nights later, when one of the younger boys spilled a pot of stew, Annie was the first to kneel and help. Her limp slowed her, but not her hands. She moved gently, carefully, without shame. And when she looked up, Wikasa was watching her. Their eyes met. Just for a moment, he said nothing, but his gaze didn't hold pity or judgment, just seeing, and that made it all the harder to hold. The next morning, Annie stood by the river with a small basket, rinsing clothes. Her fingers were red and raw from the cold water. As she wrung out the last cloth, she heard footsteps on the stones. Behind her, she turned. It was him. He didn't speak, not right away. He held out a strip of cured venison wrapped in bark. She hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she said softly. Wicasa nodded, then crouched beside the stream, washing his hands. "Your voice," he said, after a long silence, "is soft, but not weak." Annie blinked, startled by the rough tenderness in his words. "I ain't used to folks listening to it," she replied, unsure why her heart was beating so fast. He looked up at her then. They didn't know how. They began to speak more after that, slowly, in pieces, not every day. Sometimes he'd just pass by her teepee and leave something at the flap, berries, herbs, a woven pouch. Other times they sat by the river at dusk, not speaking at all. It was in that silence that she learned the most. Wicasa had lost a wife. Years ago. Illness. He had no children, no family, save the tribe. But he moved like a man who knew how to carry grief without breaking under it. Maybe that's why he saw her differently. Maybe broken people recognized each other not by the cracks, but by the way they kept walking anyway. One morning, Annie woke to find the old medicine woman frowning at her fire pit. She said a name, harsh and unfamiliar. Her eyes darted to the woods. Wicasa came not long after. He looked tense, his jaw set. A white man was seen near the trail, he said, riding hard, asking about a girl. Annie's blood turned to ice. She knew who it was, or rather, who it could be. Not him, not the father of her child. He'd vanished. No, this would be someone from Dry Creek, sheriff maybe, or one of the townsmen with too much pride and not enough business. "They won't take you," Wicasa said. She looked up at him, her hands trembling. "I don't want trouble brought here, not to your people. They are my people. You are here. That makes you part of this place too." But the tension grew. By the week's end, 2 riders had been spotted near the edge of the valley. Strangers didn't just pass through these lands, not without a reason. Word traveled through the village like wind through grass. And though no one said it outright, Annie could feel the weight of eyes on her again. Suspicion. Danger. It followed her like a shadow, growing darker with each setting sun. One night, as the fire crackled and distant drumming echoed from the hills, Annie turned. "Dovicasa, maybe I should leave," she said quietly. He didn't answer at first. Then, "If you walk away because you're afraid, they win." Again. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm tired of being the thing people fear, the thing they blame." He turned to her. "Then let them fear, let them talk, but don't run from what you are." She didn't ask him what he saw when he looked at her. She didn't have to. His presence, steady and unshaken, said more than any vow ever could. It happened 3 days after the warning. The sky had gone gray, the wind sharper. Wicasa had gone to scout with a few hunters, promising to return before dusk. Annie spent the morning weaving by the fire, ignoring the way her belly twisted with unease. That was when she heard hoofbeats, not 1 rider, 3, charging. Before she could rise, the teepee flap burst open. Sheriff Thomas Rigg and 2 townsmen from Dry Creek stepped inside, boots coated in prairie dust. Rigg's eyes found her instantly, cold, calculating. "Well, look at that," he sneered, "just where they said you'd be." Annie rose, but slowly. She was 8 months pregnant now, unsteady on her feet, especially with her limp. "What do you want?" she asked, voice barely steady. "What's owed?" Rigg growled. "You think you can run off 'cause scandals shack up with savages and no one notices?" She clenched her fists. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No, but you brought it on yourself. That boy, he was a Callahan. You think his mother wasn't going to find out? You ruined him, ruined yourself. But you're gonna come back with us now. Gonna answer for what you done." "I ain't going back," she whispered. Rigg stepped forward and slapped her. The blow came fast and sharp, knocking her sideways into the bed of furs. Her head cracked against the wood bowl beside her. Blood trickled down her cheek. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, glancing at the men behind him. "We'll drag her if we have to." She tried to scream, But no one heard her. Not yet. And then, a shout. One of the Lakota boys saw them. Called out. The men bolted, grabbing her by the arms and dragging her out of the teepee. The world spinning, pain blooming in her belly and her chest. Cries echoed across the valley, a warning, a call to arms. But the riders were already gone, hauling her between them, her feet scraping snow and earth. They didn't get far. The horse stumbled over a frozen stream crossing, and Annie fell, hard, onto the ice. Her scream tore through the trees, more from the sharp pain in her stomach than the fall. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. The baby was too early. The pain was different now. Rhythmic. Crippling. One of the men cursed. "She's going into labor," Riggs spat. "Leave her. Let the animals take care of her since she loves them so much." They turned, rode off. Annie was alone. The wind howled over the ridge, blowing snow into her eyes. She tried to crawl, fingers digging into the frozen dirt, but every inch of her burned. Her face pressed into the snow, wet and red with blood, her body twisting with the force of contractions. She was too weak, too cold. This was it, she thought. This was how it ended. A broken girl in the woods giving birth to a fatherless child in the snow. But then, footsteps. At first she thought she was imagining them. Then, the crunch of leather on frost. A shadow knelt beside her, warm hands lifting her head. Wicasa. No words. No panic. Just presence. Quiet. Steady. He wrapped her in his fur cloak and lifted her gently, careful of her belly, her head. She clutched his coat, not even realizing she was crying until her throat gave out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't have to be," he said. Back in the village, the women were all ready, preparing. Word had traveled. The healer had the fire going, blankets stacked, herbs steeping in boiling water. Wicasa carried Annie into the teepee himself, never once leaving her side. The pain came in waves. Hours passed. Time bent. She screamed, sobbed, nearly broke. She begged the world to let her go, to end it, to take the pain away, but Wicasa stayed. He didn't offer promises. He didn't say it would all be okay. He simply held her hand and stayed. At one point she grabbed his shirt and whispered, I can't do this." "You are doing it," he said, softly. "You already are." And when her baby finally arrived, small, crying, alive, Annie didn't even have the strength to hold it. She collapsed, trembling, into Wicasa's arms. The healer laid the child against her chest. A girl. Annie stared down at her daughter, her tears falling freely now, not from pain, but from something else, something close to awe. "I thought I'd die before I saw her," she whispered. "You lived," Wicasa said, brushing a lock of damp hair from her forehead. "You fought." She looked at him through glassy eyes. "Why do you keep coming back?" He didn't smile, didn't joke, just said, "Because you're worth standing beside." And in that moment, with her daughter against her chest and the world silent around her, she believed him. The snow melted slowly that spring, drips from pine needles, mud trails thick with deer tracks, smoke from cooking fires mixed with the scent of wild onions and damp earth. Life had begun again, tentative, careful, and stronger for having nearly slipped away. Annie moved slower those first weeks after the birth, but she moved. She wrapped her daughter, now named Wiaka, Feather, in soft rabbit hide and carried her from the teepee to the water's edge, whispering to her about the world, every bird, every stone, every sound. She sang too, her voice, unsteady at first, like something unused for years. But Wicasa always noticed. When she sang, when she smiled, when she dared. And Annie began to notice things about him as well. The way he carved wood with reverence, as if shaping not just tools, but memories. The way he stared into the fire some nights as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. They were healing, not fast, not clean, but together. One afternoon, Wicasa asked, What did you dream of? Before all of this? Annie looked toward the far hills. I used to think I'd marry a ranch hand, live on open land, feed chickens, maybe make quilts for the church ladies. He smiled. That all? Well, she added, grinning faintly, maybe raise horses. That made him pause. Come with me tomorrow, he said. At sunrise, Wicasa led her beyond the village to a valley she'd never seen before, green, wide, alive with possibility. At its heart, a single wooden structure stood half-built, walls, stacked with care, the frame of a roof catching the light. She turned to him slowly. What is this? Our home, he said. Her breath caught. You built this? He nodded. Started it 2 winters ago. Didn't know why. Just knew I had to. Annie stepped inside the unfinished doorway, baby tucked to her chest. Dirt floor, raw beams, wind whistling through the cracks. It was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. I don't have much to offer, she whispered. You already gave me everything, he said, when you stayed. That summer, they worked side by side. The Lakota helped raise the roof, thatch it with bark and woven grass. Annie painted the door with blue pigment, shaped from crushed wildflowers. Wicasa caught 2 wild mustangs near the river. She named them Birch and Flame. They built a corral, then a fire pit, then a small garden where she planted potatoes and herbs, her baby tied to her back with woven cloth. It wasn't just a home. It was a statement that they survived, that they belonged, that the past had not won. But peace, like the wind, never stays too long. One afternoon, while Wicasa was hunting and Annie walked Wiyaka near the stream, she heard the sound of riders again, not from Dry Creek this time, but government men. Soldiers. They didn't enter the village, but Annie saw them from the ridge. 4 of them, blue coats, rifles, maps in hand. They were surveying, claiming. Whispers spread fast that week. The land would be divided, reservations would be moved. Homes like theirs, quiet, mixed, unrecognized, were never safe when government started drawing lines. I can talk to them, Annie said one night, when she and Wicasa sat by the fire. Maybe if they knew we meant no harm. No, he said too fast. Then softened. They don't come to talk. They come to decide. But we built this. I know. Then came the letter, delivered by a rider from town, addressed in perfect script, sealed with wax. It bore the name of the Callahan family, the same family whose son had vanished months before, the boy who fathered Wiyaka and left Annie to carry shame alone. The letter offered a deal. Return to Dry Creek, sign over the child, and all charges would be dropped. The Callahans would raise the girl with dignity. Annie would disappear, quietly. No trial, no shame, no fuss. She stood at the edge of the corral, hands shaking, the letter clutched in her fist. She hadn't told Wicasa yet. She wasn't sure she could. That night, she watched Wiyaka sleep, curled like a leaf on their shared bed, cheeks flushed with warmth. Wicasa carved a small horse figurine near the fire. I got a letter, she finally said. He looked up, his knife still. They want her, she whispered. They think taking her would fix it all. Wicasa didn't speak. I don't know what to do, she continued. I'm tired of fighting, of being the shadow in people's stories. What if I'm not enough for her? What if I stay and they come and they burn everything down? He rose, crossed the floor, and knelt beside her. You are enough, he said. You were enough the day you stood up to them, and you'll be enough if they come again. But if they take her, they won't. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm so scared, she admitted. He took her hands, held them to his heart. Then be scared, but stay anyway. The next day, she rode into Dry Creek, alone. Dust covered her boots. She tied Flame to the old saloon post and walked straight into the sheriff's office. Thomas Riggs sat behind the desk, cigar in hand, smug as ever. You come to surrender? he asked. No, Annie said. I came to tell you she's not for sale. She's not yours. She never was. You'll regret that. Maybe. But at least I'll do it knowing I stood my ground. He rose. You think those people will protect you? You think the world's gonna just forget? She met his eyes. No, but I don't need the world to forget. I just need my daughter to remember I never gave her away. And she turned, walked out. The ride back was silent, but something in her had changed. She wasn't running anymore, she was choosing, and choice, that was power. They finished the home by the end of summer. Birch and Flame grazed in the paddock. Wiyaka took her first steps near the hearth. Annie hung a small quilt above their bed, stitched from scraps, colored with berries and dreams. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the fields, Wikasa led her outside. He held a ring, not silver, but carved from bone. Simple, honest. He didn't ask a question. He didn't have to. Annie smiled, tears burning her throat. Yes, she whispered. Yes, always. And as they stood there, wind in their hair, baby in her arms, firelight flickering from the window behind them, they knew. The world would never forget what they'd survived, but it would never define who they became. They didn't throw rice or light lanterns. There was no church choir, no father walking her down the aisle, but the stars had gathered like witnesses above them, and that was enough. The Lakota stood in a circle at the edge of the valley, just beyond the corral fence. The wind was soft. The fire burned low. Tatan stood barefoot in a dress she'd sewn from canvas and deerskin, her hair braided in 2 long strands that fell over her shoulders. Her daughter clung to her side, sleepy but curious. Wikasa stood across from her in his best tunic, beaded, worn, proud. They didn't say vows in English. They didn't need to. The elder spoke in Lakota, placing a red cloth between them, symbolizing the path they'd walk together. He tied a strand of hide around their joined hands, 2 scars, 2 pasts, 2 souls meeting not in perfection, but in truth. When it was over, Annie looked into Wikasa's eyes and whispered, I thought no one would ever choose me out loud. I always did, he said. But fate, as always, had one final test. It came the next week, uninvited, dust-covered, and wearing a federal badge, an agent of the Bureau. The government had finally responded to Dry Creek's claims. They demanded names, census records, proof of identity, and worst of all, a relocation agreement. The land Annie and Wikasa had built on was deemed unsanctioned. If you stay here, the man said, tapping a rolled-up map, you'll be considered trespassers. Wikasa stayed silent, but Annie stepped forward. This is our home. You're not listed as married under any legal record, the agent said. Your daughter isn't registered. This whole place doesn't exist. Annie stared him down. Good, she said. Then you can't take what you can't see. He handed her a paper. You've got 7 days. They gathered that night, around the fire. The village elders offered one solution. Move north. There was safer land, further from the border, far from Dry Creek and its reach. They could start again, together. But Annie had to decide. Stay and fight the system head-on, risking everything. Or go, and leave behind the ashes of a town that never truly claimed her. She walked to the stream that night, holding her daughter's tiny hand. Watched the water slip between stones. Remembered the girl who'd once collapsed in that same snow, bleeding and afraid. That girl was gone now. She whispered into the dark. I don't owe them anything. When she returned, she looked at Wikasa and said, Let's go. Not as surrender, as beginning. They left at dawn. No fanfare, no goodbyes. Just the 3 of them, Annie, Wikasa, and Wiyaka, riding north, past the hills and across the border of memory. She didn't look back. Not even once, because the past wasn't her home anymore. Months later, in a clearing near the Bitterroot Mountains, they built again. The home was smaller, but sturdier. Annie kept her herbs in clay jars by the window. Wicasa raised a herd of 3 horses. Wiyaka chased butterflies in the grass, and every night, Annie wrote in a small leather journal. The stories weren't about pain, not anymore. They were about healing, about choosing, about what it meant to build something no one could name but them. One page held the name of the child she never got to meet. Another held the name of the man who once tried to destroy her. But most of the pages, most of them were filled with laughter, firelight, and the sound of a baby's first word. Mama. One evening, as snow fell gently outside, Annie sat by the hearth with Wicasa beside her. They watched Wiyaka sleep, cheeks rosy, arms curled around the carved horse her father made. Do you ever miss it? Wicasa asked. Dry Creek? He nodded. She was quiet a moment. Then, no, I don't miss the place. But I do think about the girl I used to be there. Was she strong? She was surviving, Annie whispered. Now she's living. And as the snow thickened, and their fingers laced together beneath the blanket, no more words were needed, no more proving, no more shame, just a quiet hand held tight in the snow. Subscribe, and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.